We start this hour in West Asia, and Hamas's armed wing has stated that fighters held up in the Israeli-held Rafah area of Gaza will not surrender to Israel. Hamas has urged mediators to find a solution to a crisis that threatens the month-old ceasefire. Sources close to mediation efforts told Reuters news agency on Thursday that fighters could surrender their arms in exchange for passage to other areas of the enclave under a proposal aimed at resolving the stalemate. Now, Egyptian mediators have proposed that, in exchange for safe passage, fighters still in Rafah surrender their arms to Egypt and give details of tunnels so they can be destroyed. This is said by one of the sources, an Egyptian security official. Now, the latest statement from the Al-Qassam brigades, an armed wing of Hamas, held Israel responsible for engaging the fighters, while Israel has said that their forces were defending themselves. Now, joining us for this discussion is Jordan Cope. He is a Middle East expert who joins us live from Dallas, Texas. Jordan, thank you very much for joining us. Hamas says its remaining fighters in Rafah won't surrender, while Israel maintains troops are acting in self-defense. Of course, the United Nations has said that 1.9 million Gazans and roughly 85% of the enclave's population have been displaced. Is this more displacement, Jordan?
This is simply Israel retaining its positions in a very dangerous part of the Gaza Strip. Since the ceasefire has commenced, 3 Israeli soldiers have been attacked and killed, attacked unilaterally, I must add, by Hamas, in the process violating key provisions of the ceasefire agreement and killing Israeli soldiers. Israeli soldiers, like any other nation, shouldn't be expected to be sitting ducks on the front lines while trying to preserve a ceasefire agreement, no less trying to make sure that a terrorist group doesn't take advantage of that ceasefire agreement, as they have done time and time again. The simple conditions that are being proposed by Egypt as a mediator are very simple. Simply that Hamas disarm, and that these 200 fighters located in Rafah help Israel identify and locate tunnels so they can be destroyed. One of the most key foremost provisions of the current pending ceasefire agreement in place right now is that Hamas ultimately disarm. And if Hamas ultimately cannot disarm from Rafah, surrender their weapons for their own survival, what good is the rest of the ceasefire deal?
But Jordan, Egyptian mediators proposed safe passage if fighters hand over weapons and, of course, reveal the tunnel maps underneath the enclave. Given that both Qatar and Egypt, both former mediators trusted by Israel, have backed this plan, why hasn't Israel signalled support?
I wouldn't say they're fully trusted by Israel. Qatar has given Hamas approximately $2 billion since 2012. The reality of geopolitics is that these are the countries that potentially could forge some sort of agreement. Israel certainly has a right to be skeptical because its own national security is at stake, and tunnels have been found under complexes built by Qatar in the Gaza Strip. So Israel has every right to remain skeptical regarding Qatar's ultimate motives when it comes to the Gaza Strip, because Qatar refuses to recognize Israel, it refuses to have diplomatic relations with Israel, and at the end of the day, Qatar as a mediator is one that cannot be trusted fully.
And Jordan, in this latest statement from the Al-Qassam brigades, it says Israel is responsible for engaging the fighters, and Israel, of course, have stated that they were merely defending themselves in this situation. Your thoughts on this combat of information, of course, that is all too common during this conflict?
Hamas's statements, especially that of the Al-Qassam brigades, which is its military wing, should never be taken at face value. Just about everything Hamas has espoused throughout the war, statements have been full of misinformation. And Israel has had to pay the price most recently, as I mentioned earlier. 3 Israeli soldiers were killed, literally just trying to enforce the ceasefire agreement, not entertaining violence, maintaining the peace. Ultimately, they paid the price with their own lives. So Al-Qassam's statement that Israel is simply engaging these Hamas fighters simply couldn't be further from the truth. I think the number one question we need to ask at the end of the day is, when media kept on claiming that there is such a famine crisis in Gaza and Hamas blamed Israel, these Hamas fighters have now been stuck in tunnels for approximately 6 days. One has to question how they were able to manage to store so much food down in those tunnels and continue to quote unquote resist. And in light of Hamas's statement that these fighters will not surrender, one has to question whether Hamas's motives are ultimately suicidal for all.
Now, of course, a broader question next, Jordan. You, of course, mentioned that there's been deaths of 3 Israeli soldiers since October the 10th. Of course, over 200 people have been killed in Gaza since that ceasefire was announced earlier on this month. Your overall analysis of the fragility of the current ceasefire deal and the likeliness of it moving on to the second phase?
It definitely remains to be seen. The United States is ultimately one of the strongest actors, and the United States seems to want to preserve the ceasefire agreement. Hamas ultimately killing Israeli soldiers escalated conflict within the Gaza Strip and resulted in ultimately some airstrikes that ensued. Also important to note that one of the key militant groups in the Gaza Strip, a terrorist org, the Islamic Jihad, is not a party to the agreement. So this agreement is not binding upon them and how Israel responds to them. However, all of this being said, Hamas has definitely toyed with the ceasefire agreement. It has returned bodies of deceased hostages late. It has returned remains of those not supposedly belonging to the hostages identified. And of course, on top of that, it has blatantly attacked Israeli troops, violating the most key provisions while also not disarming. Hamas has materially violated key conditions of the ceasefire agreement. It has made clear that it has no intent to disarm. And ultimately, if Hamas refuses to disarm, however the United States might try to preserve the ceasefire agreement, it might be very fragile. And we might also see tensions escalate in Lebanon, where the Lebanese government has ultimately failed to disarm Hezbollah.
Yeah, we will talk about that in just a second, Jordan. But we move on to our next story, and we move from the Palestinian territory and over to Israel. And as the dispute over jurisdiction on the Sadi T-Men hostage abuse video probe escalates, the High Court of Justice has now issued interim injunctions to all authorities to file responses by today at 8 p.m. A hearing on the petitions is scheduled for Tuesday before High Court Justices Yael Wilner, Alex Steen and Gila Carney-Steinitz. The order was issued in order to expedite the judicial process due to the highly sensitive nature of the situation and the tension between different government agencies and figures who are in parallel claiming authority over investigation. Now let's move over